today, September 10th, 2022.
Ceremonial places across London and across the UK. Clive, what are your thoughts?
I think it's time for a dose of reality, what the history really is. The City of London, for example, is like a storied version of Wall Street. It's the centre of the trading which built the British Empire. And let's remember that who Charles II was. In 1660, Charles II signed the Charter of the Royal African Company, which began the slave trade across the Atlantic. And the money that came from the slave trade poured into the City of London, the place that you're now looking at. St Paul's is the sort of centre of that. And that money from the slave trade funded the Industrial Revolution, went a long way to fund the Industrial Revolution, which made Britain into a modern power. All the money that generated from the Industrial Revolution created the empire that Victoria inherited. So I think it's always important. Pageant is intoxicating, and no one does it better, as we're seeing today. It's a glorious pageant, but I think it's as important to understand the role of the pageant as a kind of intoxicant, as well as something that establishes continuity with the past. It's very good to establish continuity with the past, but the past should be a real past and not a fake one. And I think this brings to a head the whole point of what's going on now, which is that somehow King Charles III has got to make the journey from the past to the future. What we're seeing at the moment is a kind of Monty Python version of the past. It's glorious, and I think the producers of The Crown, the series of The Crown, must be extremely jealous of the production standards here because they're amazing. But I would like to just make this point that every time you watch one of these ceremonies, there's a historical truth behind it, and we must bear that in mind because that is going to be part of the burden that King Charles III has to deal with. The unrest in the Commonwealth, the unrest in the Caribbean. A terrible mistake was made when Will and Kate went to the Caribbean earlier this year because they hadn't been instructed in the historical truths and past of slavery. And even after slavery was abolished in 1834 in the Empire, by that time a whole white supremacy hierarchy had been built. So those colonies were still ruled by a combination of London directives and a local kind of Raj, which depressed social progress. That's why it took so long for the indigenous peoples of the Commonwealth. It's taken until now, virtually, for the indigenous peoples of the Commonwealth to come truly into their own.
And Prince William and Kate were met with protests when they made that visit. I'm glad you brought this up because I wonder, given the history of colonialism, the history of the British Empire, and all that has happened, and there have been critics who have come out in recent days and said, I understand the family is mourning, but generations of my family have been in mourning for what was done to them. Are we going to hear an apology, potentially, from a King Charles?
Well, I think there's another thing going on here too. They talk about the United Kingdom, and that was very much stressed by Charles. That means Scotland in particular and Ireland. Now, these are two very tricky problems that Charles is going to face because the movement for Scottish independence, as long as the Queen was on the throne, the Scots were pledged to allegiance to the Queen. But Nicola Sturgeon, who's the now leader of the SNP, doesn't hold to that, and if Scottish independence is brought to a vote again, it may get much closer than it was before. Whether that happens quickly or not, the fact is that there's a strong movement in Scotland to break the Union, which is an incredible breakup. That would be a very serious breakup of the Union. And then there's Northern Ireland, where the new Prime Minister is showing every sign of going back on pledges made. And I would remind us that the Queen did an incredible job in reconciling the Crown with the history of Ireland in 2011 when she went to Dublin and made a speech in which she achieved an amazing thing. It was like putting the whole of the past between Britain and Ireland behind her. It was greeted extremely warmly, and she even went in I think it was the year after 2012, and was seen shaking hands with Martin McGuinness, who was the architect of the assassination, the IRA leader, who was the architect of the assassination of Earl Mountbatten, who was very close to the Queen. You can't get a greater act of reconciliation than one like that. So now to start going back, as this new Tory government will do, on pledges made on the Good Friday Agreement, which was the reason why the Queen went to Dublin in the first place, to celebrate the achievement by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton played a huge part in the Good Friday Agreement, because the Irish factions, particularly in New York and Boston, were so reluctant to come to any kind of terms with the Brits, because there's such a deep Irish tradition over here. And the Queen, without the Queen, because she was not a political figure, without the Queen, I don't think that reconciliation and the Good Friday Agreement could have been carried out, but it was.
Clive, hold on 1 second. I'm going to come back to this conversation, but just for everyone to know, behind us, and we can zoom in with our camera here, hopefully, King Charles is now making a roundabout into Buckingham Palace. We can see the royal standard on his car up there in the front. Cheers from the crowd here that is assembled again. Tens of thousands of people coming here to witness it. We do not know whether he will go directly into the gates of Buckingham Palace, or if he will do a repeat of yesterday where he gets out and he greets the crowd. But you can see it there again, the royal standard flying from his car. Wherever he is, that will fly. We're seeing it at full staff, above Buckingham Palace. The royal standard never goes to half staff, because there is always a queen or a king. There is always a monarch. And as I can tell right now, that car is driven directly into Buckingham Palace. It appears he is not going to be getting out, at least right in this moment. We would perhaps see it later on today. He will have a meeting with many cabinet members, the opposition leader of Parliament as well. I believe Prime Minister Truss will be present. She again already met him for the first time as king yesterday, and she as prime minister. Important to remember, she's only been prime minister for a few days. A 3-day-old prime minister meeting a 1-day-old king in terms of title. John?
Katie, we've never had a week like it in British history, or I would challenge anybody that on Monday we had a head of state and a prime minister who are not the same head of state and prime minister this Saturday.
It's remarkable.
The week started with the Queen and Boris Johnson, and the week ends with King Charles and Liz Truss. No one could have imagined these two seismic events coinciding, overlapping in such a dramatic way. And what we're looking at now, it was, and the clouds parted.
I was going to say the clouds have parted, and the sun is out. If you don't like the weather, don't worry. 5 minutes, it'll change.
Exactly. But the clouds parted as the King's car with the royal standard fluttering above it drove down the Mall and into Buckingham Palace, and an extraordinary moment for the crowds. And it is absolutely rammed. Trying to get to where we're broadcasting from right now, I really had to use some sharp elbows to say, can you let me through, please? Because there were so many people trying to get here.
The cheers weren't as loud as I would expect.
I suspect they would have been much, much louder if we saw the King emerge. And who knows, he might still. I note, just for what it's worth, that the gates there
have remained open.
And who knows whether the King will come out to greet what we used to call his subjects, but the British people.
Clive, I do want to go back to the conversation we were having, and I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I did want to bring that to everybody watching at home. But continue on, because it is a difficult moment. It's a fraught moment.
Well, what you were just discussing is true. An astonishing week, but bear this in mind too, that in the course of a few days, two relative novices have come to power, and neither of them was selected by democratic means. Hereditary succession is like a game of Russian roulette. Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes you don't get lucky. We didn't get lucky with Edward VIII, the abdication. We got lucky with George VI and George VI's daughter, the Queen Elizabeth. We're now going to find out whether we got lucky with Charles or not. So it's a random system. Liz Truss was selected by the most unrepresentative caucus of, or demographic, if you like, that you could imagine. About 160,000, mostly white, fairly well off, fairly right-wing Tories. So in order to get elected, she had to satisfy the criteria that they sought, rather than the criteria that the country wanted in a political leader. Had there been a general election to select the new Prime Minister, I'm pretty sure she would have been defeated by a large margin. So now we have a precarious financial situation, an economy which is performing very badly, a winter energy crisis coming, the needs to manage the country. What the Queen did was an amazing act of watching and presiding over, on the whole, a pretty skillful management of imperial decline. When she came to the throne, the empire was largely there. She oversaw the dismantling of the empire and the conversion of the empire to the Commonwealth, and she devoted herself to that. It was very successful. It's much more difficult now when you've got a situation where the Union itself, the United Kingdom, is under threat from a kind of centrifugal force of separation. Hopefully that can be avoided, because I think it would be a very bad and unrealistic movement. But you've got that. So Charles faces a the role of the Prime Minister and the monarch are very different, obviously, and hasn't any political power, but he does have a kind of constitutional status that makes it important for him to act as the kind of glue in the constitutional arrangement. Whereas Liz Truss faces a situation that she's not really well prepared for. She's had no real sustained. She's been a kind of cynical opportunist and changed policies like a weather vane. She started off as a young activist in Oxford, wanted to abolish the monarchy. Let's remember that. And she was a Lib Democrat for some time. Now she seems to have turned hard right. That doesn't propose the kind of steadiness and political grasp and sense of overall management of decline, because the country somehow has got to get itself out of this idea that it's in permanent decline and rebound. It has rebounded from situations like this in the past, but in short, it's a very grim situation facing these two leaders now, and they are novices.
Last year, Barbados declared itself a republic. It is the first ex-British colony to make that sort of break since the 1990s. In talking about the ceremony that we're seeing, Clive, you mentioned that what it does is it does mask the underlying troubles. It does give the country a rallying point. I wonder if this might be a rallying point for the coming months, which, as Clive was mentioning, as we've been talking about, will be difficult economically for this country. Energy prices, energy bills have soared. Liz Truss has said she's going to put a cap on that. But the war in Ukraine is being felt here.
Oh, absolutely. And I think Clive is right to point out that for all the outpouring of emotion over the Queen's death and the seeming unity at the moment of the King's accession to the throne, let's not pretend that Britain doesn't have problems. It has deep problems. And the energy crisis at the moment, well, the aftermath of Brexit, which, some people will try to say there are huge advantages. If you look at it economically, it's kind of hard to see at the moment what the economic upside is. You have got the effect of energy prices because of the war in Ukraine and wholesale gas prices, and Britain is much more subject to that than you are in the United States, where you've got much greater energy independence. And people I was talking to last night were talking about bills going up threefold and then tenfold, and that businesses not knowing how on earth they're going to stay in business.
Some people were saying their energy bill is higher than their rent.
And that they are facing the prospect, potentially this winter, of having power cuts, where the lights will go out and we will sit by candlelight with blankets over our laps in 2022. This somehow seems inconceivable, and I'm not sure the British people are ready for that. So, yes, we are together as a nation right now in mourning for a beloved queen, and in the hope that, to use the lottery will show us that we have a good king, and he's been preparing for it for many years. But these are difficult times for the nation.
Two new undemocratic leaders, undemocratically voted in leaders, I should say. Clive, Irving, thank you very much. Tim Ewart, thank you as well. John, thank you. I know we're all going to stick around, though, but let us take a very short break. And when we come back, the end of an era, what King Charles might be planning for the monarchy. Its many castles, its many estates, plus every moment to the minute has been planned out inside the days leading up to a final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth.